It is a study." The words, spoken by the vicar at his elbow, were meant to be helpful. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, barely heard them. He stood frozen before the small wooden easel, the clamor of the Oakhaven village fete fading into a dull, distant roar. The sun beat down on the striped canvas tent, filling the air with the scent of crushed grass, sweet cakes, and warm humanity. It was an oppressive, cloying smell, and for a moment he felt he might suffocate on it. Before him, pinned to a simple board, was a charcoal sketch. It was not the most technically proficient piece in the modest competition he had been roped into judging. A watercolor of the village church was more vibrant. An oil painting of a prize-winning sow was certainly more robust. But this sketch had stolen the air from his lungs. It was a study, his study. Not just any study, but the inner sanctum of Blackwood Manor, a room no villager from Oakhaven would have ever been permitted to enter. The artist had captured it with an intimacy that was unnerving. It was all there. The precise way the afternoon light fell through the tall Palladian window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The faint circular stain on the mahogany desk where he always placed his brandy snifter. The third leather-bound volume from the left on the bottom shelf, its spine slightly cracked from overuse. Even the subtle fraying on the arm of his favorite wingback chair, a detail he himself barely noticed, was rendered with aching precision. This was not a drawing from memory. This was a drawing from life, from hours spent observing, from knowing. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in his stomach. It was the same feeling that had haunted his hollow existence for 5 years, the ghost of a memory, the echo of a loss so profound it had carved out the very heart of him and left a silent, echoing cavern. "Extraordinary detail, is it not, Your Grace?" The vicar pressed on, oblivious. "The artist is simply signed E. Smith, a newcomer to the village, I believe, a quiet woman, a widow." E. Smith. The name meant nothing, but the initial E. No, it was impossible. A cruel trick of the mind, a ghost summoned by his own ceaseless, grinding guilt. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and brushed the rough texture of the paper. The charcoal felt gritty, real. The image did not waver. It stared back at him, a silent accusation. A portrait of a room that had once been a shared space, a sanctuary, and was now nothing more than a beautifully appointed tomb. His mind flashed back, an unwelcome and violent intrusion. 5 years ago, that room, the scent of rain on the window panes and the low crackle of a fire in the hearth. He remembered the fury, cold and righteous, that had possessed him. He had been a different man then, a man convinced of his own judgment, a man easily led by the subtle, venomous whispers of his mother. The Dowager Duchess Isabella had presented him with the letter. Her expression was one of carefully constructed sorrow, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture of maternal sympathy that he now recognized as pure theater. The letter itself was damning. Flowery prose, intimate recollections, plans for a clandestine meeting. It was addressed to his wife, Eleonora, and signed with a flourish by a man he knew to be a visiting cousin, a notorious rake. He had not questioned it. He had not considered the source. The evidence seemed absolute, confirming 100 of his mother's insinuations that his young, beautiful wife was flighty, unhappy, perhaps even unfaithful. His pride, a brittle and monstrous thing, had shattered. He confronted her in that very study. She had been arranging flowers, her slender fingers gentle on the stems of the white roses he had ordered for her. He remembered the scent of them, clean and sweet, a stark contrast to the poison on his tongue. "What is the meaning of this?" he had demanded, his voice a low growl. He threw the letter onto the desk, watching it skitter across the polished wood and come to rest beside her vase. Eleonora had looked up, her wide gray eyes startled. She read the letter, her face draining of all color until her skin was as pale and translucent as the rose petals. She looked back at him, her expression not one of guilt, but of profound, shattering bewilderment. "Alistair," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. "I do not understand. I have never seen this before." "Do not lie to me," he had snarled, the words tearing from him. "Do you take me for a fool?" "A fool?" Her voice gained a sliver of its usual strength, a spark of defiance in the face of his onslaught. "No, I take you for my husband, the man who is supposed to trust me. Trust must be earned, and it is easily broken." He had been quoting his mother, though he did not realize it then. The words were not his own. They were borrowed poison. He watched her spirit crumble. It was not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet, terrible implosion. The light in her eyes extinguished, leaving behind a gray, desolate emptiness. She did not cry. She did not scream or protest further. She simply folded into herself, becoming small and still. The silence that followed was more damning than any argument. It was the sound of a heart breaking. It was the sound of a chasm opening between them, a void he had created with his own blind rage. That night, she was gone. She had taken nothing of value. Her jewels lay untouched in their velvet boxes. Her lavish gowns hung like hollow husks in the wardrobe. She had taken only a small valise of plain clothes and a modest sum of money from her personal accounts. She had vanished as completely as a puff of smoke, leaving behind only the suffocating silence and the faint, lingering scent of white roses. In the days that followed, his anger cooled into a sickening dread. His mother had been triumphant, speaking of good riddance and the sullied family name now cleansed, but Alistair found no relief. The manor, once merely quiet, became tomb-like. Every room echoed with Eleonora's absence. He found himself wandering through her chambers, touching the cool silk of her abandoned dressing gown, staring at the empty space on the pillow beside his own. The investigation he had launched was perfunctory, designed more to satisfy societal expectations than to actually find her. He had been too proud, too wounded, to admit he might have been wrong. He allowed the world to believe she had run off with her lover. He allowed the lie to fester. But over the years, the lie had begun to poison him. Doubt, a slow-acting acid, ate away at the foundations of his certainty. He remembered the look in her eyes. It was not the look of a guilty woman. It was the look of a soul, utterly betrayed. He began to see his mother's manipulations with a clarity that horrified him. Her constant, subtle digs at Eleonora, her satisfaction at her departure, her eagerness to fill the void Eleonora had left. He started his own, secret inquiry. He hired a man in London, a discreet investigator who specialized in delicate matters. The first revelation was that the cousin, the supposed author of the letter, had been in Scotland for the entire month the letter was supposedly written. The second, more damning discovery came from a handwriting expert. The letter, he concluded, was a clever forgery, likely traced from Eleonora's own elegant script to mimic certain characteristics, but ultimately penned by a different hand. A hand, the expert noted, that displayed tremors of age. The truth settled upon him not like a sudden blow, but like a slow, crushing weight. He had been a pawn, a cruel, arrogant, blind fool. He had destroyed his own life, his own happiness, based on a lie fabricated by his own mother, and he had driven away the only woman he had ever, in his own fumbling and inadequate way, truly loved. He had spent the last 2 years searching for her. His investigators had followed cold trails across the country, and even to the continent. They found nothing. It was as if she had ceased to exist. He had resigned himself to a life of quiet, deserved misery, a penance for his sins, and now, this, a charcoal sketch in a dusty tent in a forgotten corner of his own duchy. "Your Grace?" The vicar's voice was laced with concern. "Are you quite well?" Alistair blinked, the study in the drawing dissolving back into the sunlit chaos of the fete. He drew a steadying breath. "I am fine, Vicar. I have made my decision." He pointed a finger, the gesture unnaturally stiff. "This one, the sketch. It is the winner." A murmur went through the small crowd that had gathered. He could feel their surprise. They had all expected him to choose the sentimental church or the portly pig. "A fine choice, Your Grace," the vicar said, recovering quickly. "An unconventional one, but a fine choice. We shall announce it and summon the artist to receive her prize." "No," Alistair said, his voice hard. "Do not announce it. Simply give me the artist's name and address. I will deliver the prize myself." The vicar's eyebrows shot up. A duke, delivering a prize of 5 sovereigns in person. It was unheard of, but one did not argue with the Duke of Blackwood. "Of course, Your Grace, as you wish." The vicar shuffled through some papers on a nearby table. "Here we are, E. Smith, Rose Cottage, at the very end of Miller's Lane." Alistair nodded, his heart hammering against his ribs. He took the drawing from the easel, his touch gentle, as if handling a sacred relic. He rolled it carefully, his mind a maelstrom of hope and terror. What would he find at Rose Cottage? A stranger? A coincidence? Or would he find her? And if he did, what would she be? A ghost from his past? A woman hardened by 5 years of solitary struggle? Would she even speak to him? And what, in God's name, could he possibly say to her? Miller's Lane was little more than a muddy track winding away from the village green. It was bordered by overgrown hedgerows, thick with wildflowers and buzzing insects. At the very end, tucked behind a sprawling oak tree, sat a small, whitewashed cottage. Rose Cottage. It was humble, with a thatched roof that had seen better days and a small garden in the front, riotous with color. Foxgloves and lupins stood tall, and a tangle of climbing roses, the color of blushing cream, fought for purchase on the crumbling stone walls. It was peaceful. It was the sort of place a person could disappear into. Alistair dismounted, leaving his horse tethered to a low, hanging branch. He walked the short path to the heavy oak door, the rolled drawing clutched in his hand like a talisman. His ducal signet ring felt absurdly heavy, a chunk of gold and history that had no place in this simple, rustic world. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He commanded thousands of acres, hundreds of tenants, and a fortune that could ransom a king. And yet, he had never felt so powerless. Before his knuckles could touch the wood, the door creaked open. A small boy stood in the doorway, regarding him with an expression of solemn curiosity. He could not have been more than 4 years old, perhaps 5. He had a smudge of dirt on his cheek and a mop of unruly dark hair that fell into his eyes. His eyes. Alistair felt the world tilt on its axis. The boy's eyes were a startling, luminous gray. They were Eleonora's eyes. They were his eyes. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his breath catching in his throat. A son. He had a son. A son he had never known, never held. A son who had been growing up in this tiny cottage while he rattled around his empty, cavernous manor. The boy tilted his head. "Are you the postman?" he asked, his voice clear and high. "You're very tall for a postman." Alistair could not find his voice. He could only stare, his mind reeling. "Arthur, do not stand there with the door open." A woman's voice called from within the cottage. It was a voice he had heard every night in his dreams for 5 years. Lower, perhaps, a little rougher around the edges. But it was hers. She appeared in the doorway behind the boy, wiping her hands on an apron. And there she was, Eleonora. She was different. The soft, ethereal beauty he remembered had been honed into something stronger, sharper. Her hair, once meticulously styled, was braided simply down her back. Her hands, once soft and pale, were chapped and capable. She wore a dress of plain, dark wool, a far cry from the silks and velvets she had once favored, but it was her. The same elegant line of her jaw, the same proud set of her shoulders, and the same gray eyes, which now widened in shock and disbelief as they met his. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the threshold. The air crackled with 5 years of silence, of anger, of pain. The boy, Arthur, looked from his mother's stricken face to the tall stranger's stunned one, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Mama?" he asked, tugging on her skirt. "Who is this man?" Eleonora's face, which had been a mask of shock, hardened into something impenetrable. Her hand came to rest protectively on her son's shoulder. She drew the boy slightly behind her, a lioness shielding her cub. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was ice. "He is no one," she said, her eyes locked on Alistair's. "He is the Duke of Blackwood, and he is lost." The words were a dismissal, a judgment, an entire history of betrayal packed into a few, perfectly chosen syllables. She made a move to close the door, to shut him out of this life she had built, to erase him as thoroughly as he had once erased her. "Eleonora, wait," he managed, the name feeling foreign and sacred on his tongue. He held up the rolled sketch. I came about the drawing." Her eyes flickered to the paper in his hand, and a flicker of something, annoyance, regret, crossed her features. She had not expected this. She had entered the contest for the 5 sovereigns, a small sum that would have meant new shoes for her son, and a little extra for the larder. She had not, for a single moment, imagined the judge would be him. She had drawn the study from a memory so vivid it was like a wound that would not heal. It was an act of exorcism, an attempt to put a part of her past onto paper so that she might finally be free of it. Instead, it had summoned the past to her very doorstep. "The prize money can be collected from the vicar," she said, her voice clipped and devoid of emotion. "There was no need for you to come here, Your Grace." "Your Grace." She used the title like a weapon, a wall to keep him at a distance. It was the title she had used in the last, cold months of their marriage. "I did not come to deliver the prize," he said, his voice raw. He took a step forward, his polished boots sinking slightly into the soft earth of her garden path. "I came because of this, because no one else could have drawn this. I came to find you." "You have found me," she replied, her chin held high. "And now you may leave." "I cannot." The words were torn from him, a confession of his own desperate, aching need. "Not until we have spoken." "We have nothing to speak about," she said, her grip tightening on her son's shoulder. "Everything that needed to be said was said 5 years ago, in your study." The boy, Arthur, peeked out from behind her legs, his gray eyes wide with a child's unfiltered curiosity. "Is that your house, Mama? The one in the picture?" Eleonora flinched as if struck. "It was a long time ago, my love." "Can we go there?" the boy asked. "It looks very big." Alistair's heart fractured. This innocent child, his son, was asking to see his own home, his own birthright, as if it were a castle in a fairy tale. "Eleonora, please," he said, his voice cracking. He gestured towards the boy. He has my eyes." It was the wrong thing to say. Her face, already a mask of cold fury, shuddered completely. "He has my eyes," she corrected him, her voice dangerously low. "He has my strength. He has my heart. He has nothing of yours, because you forfeited that right. You threw it away." She began to close the door again, slowly and deliberately. "The letter was a forgery," he blurted out, the words desperate. "My mother wrote it. I have proof." The door stopped moving. He saw a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze before it was quickly extinguished. She had been hurt too deeply to allow a single seed of hope to take root. "Proof?" she scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "What proof could you possibly have that would erase what you did? You did not trust me. You did not even ask. You simply condemned me. Your proof changes nothing." "It changes everything," he insisted, stepping closer until he was standing on her doorstep, a giant of a man blocking out the afternoon sun. He was so close he could smell the faint scent of soap and lavender that clung to her. "It means I was a fool. It means I was wrong. Horribly, unforgivably wrong." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling with shallow, angry breaths. He could see the war raging within her. The woman she was now, the resilient survivor, battled with the ghost of the woman she had been, the wife who had loved him. "Your apology is 5 years too late, Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling with the effort of keeping it steady. "I have a life here, a good life, a peaceful life. My son and I, we do not need you." "He needs a father," Alistair countered, his gaze dropping to the boy, who was now staring at him with undisguised fascination. "He has a mother," she shot back fiercely, "and that has been more than enough." She finally managed to push the door closed. The heavy oak thudded shut between them, the sound as final as a coffin lid. The latch clicked into place. Alistair stood on the path, the rolled drawing still in his hand, listening to the sudden, ringing silence. He could hear the buzz of a bee in the roses, the distant bleating of a sheep, the frantic, useless beating of his own heart. He had found her. He had found his son. And he had been utterly and completely rejected. The old Alistair, the arrogant Duke, would have turned on his heel and ridden away, his pride salved by the fact that he had at least tried. But that man was gone, burned away by 5 years of regret. This new man, this humbled, broken man, knew that this was not the end. It was the beginning of his penance. He would not leave. He would not be dismissed. He had made a promise to himself that if he ever found her, he would spend the rest of his life earning back what he had so carelessly thrown away. He turned and walked back down the path, not towards his horse, but towards the village. He had to find a room at the inn. He had to find a way to stay. He would lay siege to her heart, not with ducal power or wealth, but with patience, with truth, with time, however long it took. He would not lose her again. Eleonora leaned against the closed door, her body trembling. Her hand was pressed to her mouth, stifling a sob that threatened to tear through her. Arthur clung to her legs, his small face buried in the folds of her skirt. "Mama, why did you send the tall man away?" he asked, his voice muffled. "I liked his shiny boots." She could not answer. She could only slide down the rough wood of the door until she was sitting on the cool flagstones of her cottage floor, pulling her son into her lap and holding him so tightly he squirmed in protest. She buried her face in his soft, dark hair, inhaling the familiar, comforting scent of him. He was her world. He was her anchor. He was the reason she had survived. Seeing Alistair had been like a physical assault. It had ripped open the carefully constructed piece of her life, exposing the raw, aching wound beneath. His words echoed in her mind. The letter was a forgery. He had proof. A part of her, a foolish, treacherous part, wanted to believe him. It was the part of her that still remembered the man she had married, not the cold stranger who had condemned her. The man who had once made her laugh, who had held her in the dead of night and whispered secrets against her skin. But that man had vanished long before she had. He had been replaced by the Duke, a figurehead consumed by duty and pride, and she had learned the hard way that trust, once shattered, could not be easily mended. She had built this life from the ashes of her old one. When she had fled Blackwood Manor, she was a terrified, heartbroken girl, adrift in a world she did not understand. She had found her way to Oakhaven by sheer chance, drawn by its remoteness. She had taken the name Ellen Smith, a name so plain it was like a cloak of invisibility. Mrs. Gable, the kindly, no-nonsense owner of the village inn, had taken pity on the pale, exhausted young woman who appeared on her doorstep and offered her a room in exchange for mending and laundry work. The discovery of her pregnancy had been both a terror and a blessing. It gave her a reason to fight, a purpose beyond her own survival. Arthur's birth, in the small attic room of the inn, with only Mrs. Gable to help, had been the moment Eleonora, the Duchess of Blackwood, had truly died. In her place, Ellen Smith, a mother, was born. She had saved every penny. After 2 years, she had enough to rent Rose Cottage. She earned her living with her needle and, increasingly, with her art. She sketched portraits of villagers, their children, their livestock. Her talent, a gentle pastime in her old life, had become her means of survival. It was a source of pride. Her hands, once decorated with rings, were now stained with charcoal and pricked by needles, and she had never felt more capable. Life was hard. There were times in winter when the fire burned low and the larder was nearly empty. There were nights she lay awake, terrified of the future, of illness, of being discovered. But it was an honest life. It was her life, and it was peaceful. Until now, Alistair's presence shattered that peace. He brought with him the memory of pain, of betrayal, of a gilded cage she had fought so hard to escape. And he brought a terrible, tempting offer: the truth. She stood up, her legs unsteady. She smoothed down her apron and went to the small window that overlooked the lane. She peered through the slightly warped glass. He was gone. The lane was empty. A part of her felt a profound relief. Another part, the part she refused to acknowledge, felt a sharp pang of disappointment. She had sent him away. It was the right thing to do. The only thing to do. She had to protect her son. She had to protect herself. Alistair secured a room at the Oakhaven Arms, the only inn in the village. Mrs. Gable, a stout woman with shrewd, kind eyes, looked him over with suspicion. Dukes did not typically take rooms above a village pub. Just for a few nights, Alistair explained, offering a story about surveying some outlying properties. My men will follow with my things. She did not look convinced, but she took his money and showed him to a small, clean room overlooking the village square. The bed was lumpy. The air smelled faintly of stale ale and sawdust, and the water in the pitcher was cold. It was a world away from the silken sheets and silent, efficient service of Blackwood Manor. It was perfect. It was a tangible reminder of the world Eleonora now inhabited, a world he needed to understand. His first act was to send a rider to the manor with instructions. His valet was to pack a bag of his plainest clothes. He was also to bring a man named Mr. Davies, the handwriting expert from London, and to locate a former maid by the name of Sarah Croft. It took him 2 days of discreet inquiries through his network of estate managers to find her. She was married now, living in a town 30 miles away. The message to her was simple. The Duke of Blackwood requested her presence on a matter of great importance and assured her she would be safe and well compensated for her time. While he waited, he began his patient siege. He did not go back to Rose Cottage. He knew that would only drive her further away. Instead, he made his presence in the village known, but in a quiet, unobtrusive way. He took his meals in the common room of the inn, nodding politely to the locals, who watched him with a mixture of awe and suspicion. He walked the perimeter of the village, familiarizing himself with the paths she must walk every day. On the 3rd day, he saw her. She was at the village pump, her sleeves rolled up, her arms working the heavy iron handle. Arthur was playing nearby, chasing a stray chicken. Alistair watched from a distance, his chest tight. She looked tired, the shadows under her eyes darker than he remembered. The simple physical labor was clearly demanding. He approached the woodcutter, an old man with a wiry frame who was splitting logs near the inn. Alistair paid him an exorbitant sum for a cord of his best seasoned oak, with one condition. It was to be delivered to Rose Cottage and stacked neatly by the back door, with a note that simply said it was a gift from the village fete committee to the winner of the sketching contest. A plausible lie. He saw the wood delivered from his window at the inn. He watched as Eleonora came out, read the note with a frown, and then directed the man where to stack the wood. He saw the flicker of relief on her face as she looked at the substantial pile. It was a small thing, ensuring she would be warm for the coming autumn, but it felt like a victory. The next day, his valet arrived with his things, followed by a nervous-looking man in city clothes, Mr. Davies, and a pale, terrified woman, Sarah Croft. Alistair met with them in his room at the inn. Sarah, the former maid, was trembling. She had been one of Eleonora's personal maids, a young girl his mother had always disliked. "You have nothing to fear, Sarah," Alistair said, his voice gentle. "I only want the truth. I know my mother paid you to place a letter in my wife's sewing box. I will not hold you accountable for what you did under her influence. I will, in fact, give you this." He placed a heavy purse on the table between them. It was more money than she would see in 10 years. Her eyes widened. Tears streamed down her face as the story tumbled out. The Dowager Duchess had threatened her, told her she would be thrown out without a reference, that she would starve, and she had offered her money. Sarah had taken the letter, sealed and addressed to the Duchess Eleonora, and placed it where she was told. She had been racked with guilt ever since. "She was always so kind to me, Her Grace was," Sarah wept. "She never deserved it." "No," Alistair said softly. "She did not." His next move was calculated. He needed a witness. He summoned the vicar, explaining that he had uncovered some grave information concerning his family and required a man of God to bear witness. The vicar, his curiosity piqued, agreed immediately. Alistair walked to Rose Cottage, the vicar, Mr. Davies, and Sarah trailing behind him like a strange, solemn procession. This time, when he knocked on the door, he did not hesitate. Eleonora opened it, her face immediately hardening when she saw him. Her eyes darted to the people behind him, a look of confusion and alarm crossing her features. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" she demanded. 5 minutes of your time, Eleonora," Alistair said, his tone low and serious. "That is all I ask. If after you have heard what these people have to say, you still wish me to leave, I will go and never bother you again." She looked at the vicar, whose presence lent an air of official gravity to the proceedings. She looked at the weeping woman and the serious man in spectacles. Hesitantly, she stepped aside, allowing them to enter the tiny, cramped space of her cottage. Arthur, who had been playing with wooden soldiers on the hearthrug, scrambled to his feet and hid behind his mother's skirts. The cottage was even smaller on the inside. It was one room, clean and tidy, but sparse. A bed was tucked into one corner, a small table and 2 chairs in the center. Her sketches were tacked to the walls, breathing life and beauty into the humble space. The air smelled of wood smoke and baking bread. It was a home. "This is Sarah Croft," Alistair began, his voice echoing slightly in the small room. "She was a maid at Blackwood. Sarah, please tell the Duchess what you told me." With a trembling voice, Sarah recounted the story of the Dowager Duchess's coercion, the threats, the money, the planting of the letter. Eleonora listened, her face pale, her expression unreadable. "And this," Alistair continued, gesturing to Mr. Davies, "is a handwriting expert from London. Mr. Davies?" Mr. Davies cleared his throat nervously. "Your Grace," he said, bowing his head slightly to Eleonora, "I have examined the letter in question, as well as several examples of the Dowager Duchess's correspondence and your own. It is my expert opinion, without a shadow of a doubt, that the letter was forged. The hand that wrote it was attempting to mimic yours, but it is demonstrably the hand of the Dowager Duchess." Silence descended on the small cottage. Eleonora stared at Alistair, her gray eyes searching his. For the first time since he'd arrived, the wall of ice around her seemed to crack. "Why?" she whispered, the word barely audible. "Why would she do such a thing?" "Because she was jealous," Alistair said, the truth tasting like ash in his mouth. "She resented you. She wanted me to herself. She saw you as a rival for my affection and for control of the household. And I was too blind, too arrogant to see it. He stepped towards her, his hands open at his sides in a gesture of supplication. I cannot undo what I did. I cannot give you back these 5 years. I cannot erase the pain I caused you. I live with that every day, and I will live with it for the rest of my life. All I can do is give you the truth. I was deceived, but the greater sin was my own. I should have trusted you. I should have believed in you. My lack of faith is a stain on my soul, and I am asking you, not for forgiveness, but for a chance to show you that I am not the man I was. Tears were now tracking silently down Eleonora's cheeks. She wiped them away with the back of her hand, a gesture of impatient frustration. She looked at the faces around her room, the ashamed maid, the serious expert, the concerned vicar, and she looked at her husband. He was not the proud cold duke who had cast her out. He was a man humbled, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. And then she looked down at her son, who was peering up at her, his small face a mirror of her own turmoil. He was the only thing that mattered, his safety, his happiness. I need you to leave, she said, her voice quiet but firm. All of you. I need time to think. Alistair's heart sank, but he nodded. He had promised. He turned to the others. Thank you for your time. He led them out of the cottage, leaving Eleonora alone with the truth and her son. He did not leave Oakhaven. He waited. For 2 days, there was no word. He haunted the inn, pacing his room, his appetite gone. He had laid his soul bare, and now he could do nothing but wait for her judgment. On the morning of the 3rd day, as he was staring out his window at the rain-slicked square, there was a knock on his door. It was Mrs. Gable. A message for you, Your Grace, she said, handing him a small, folded piece of paper. Her expression was uncharacteristically soft. His hands trembled as he opened it. The note was written in her beautiful, familiar script. My son has a scrape on his knee. He is asking for the tall man with the shiny boots. You may call this afternoon, if you wish. It was not a declaration of love. It was not forgiveness. But it was an opening, a tiny crack in the wall she had built around her heart. It was hope. That afternoon, Alistair walked to Rose Cottage under a sky that had cleared to a brilliant, washed blue. He carried with him not ducal pronouncements or grand gifts, but a small pot of honey from the innkeeper's hives, and a wooden toy soldier he had purchased from the village carpenter. She opened the door before he knocked. She was not wearing an apron, and her hair was loosely pinned up. She looked tired, but the defiant hardness in her eyes had softened into a weary caution. He is inside, she said, stepping back to let him in. Arthur was sitting at the table, his lower lip trembling as he looked at the angry red scrape on his knee. When he saw Alistair, his face brightened. You came back, he said. I did, Alistair said, his voice thick with emotion. He knelt down beside the boy's chair, his knees protesting at the unfamiliar movement. I heard you had a run-in with a fearsome puddle monster. Arthur giggled, a sound that was like music to Alistair's ears. I just slipped. Alistair examined the knee with a solemn expression. A very serious injury. It requires immediate application of medicinal honey and the stationing of a guard. He presented the toy soldier. This is Captain Percival. He will stand watch over your knee and ensure it heals properly. Arthur took the soldier with a gasp of delight. Eleonora watched the exchange, her arms crossed over her chest, a faint, reluctant smile playing on her lips. She saw a tenderness in Alistair, a gentle patience she had never known he possessed. This was not the Duke. This was a father. While she cleaned and bandaged the scrape, Alistair sat with Arthur, telling him a grand story about Captain Percival's adventures. He found the words came easily. He was not performing. He was simply talking to his son. Afterward, Eleonora made tea. They sat at the small table, a strange, tentative family, while Arthur marched his new soldier across the floor. "I have sent my mother away," Alistair said into the quiet, "to a dower house on the most remote part of the estate. She will not be a part of our lives again. I have also settled a generous sum on Sarah Croft, and ensured she and her husband want for nothing." Eleonora nodded, her fingers wrapped around her warm mug. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said. "Atonement requires action, not just words. I'm trying, Eleonora, to right the wrongs I have done." She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without the shield of her anger. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the gray hairs at his temples that had not been there 5 years ago. He had suffered too. His prison had been one of gilded loneliness, but it had been a prison nonetheless. "What do you want from me, Alistair?" she asked, her voice soft. He reached across the table and, for the first time in 5 years, took her hand. Her skin was rough from work, but it was the same hand he had held at the altar. "I want to come home," he said simply. "But I know that Blackwood is not a home without you. You are my home, Eleonora. You and Arthur. I want a chance to build a new life with you, not as it was before, but as partners, as equals. I want to earn your trust. I want to be a father to our son. I want to hear you laugh again." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time she did not fight them. They were tears of grief for the years they had lost, but also tears of a reluctant, fragile hope. "I do not know if I can," she whispered. "The woman you married is gone." "I know," he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "And I am glad. I love the woman who sits before me now, the artist, the mother, the survivor. She is stronger and braver than I ever deserved. Let me spend the rest of my days proving I am worthy of her." It was not a swift surrender. It took weeks. He stayed at the inn, visiting the cottage every day. He chopped wood. He repaired the leaky roof. He weeded the garden. He played with his son. He did not push or demand. He simply existed on the periphery of their lives, a quiet, constant, steady presence. He was courting her all over again, not with jewels and titles, but with calluses on his hands and mud on his boots. Slowly, Eleonora began to let him in. They talked for hours, sharing the stories of their lost years. She told him of her fears, her struggles, her triumphs. He told her of his guilt, his loneliness, his slow, painful awakening. They were two strangers, rebuilding a bridge over a chasm of their own making. The day she finally agreed to return to Blackwood, it was on her terms. Rose Cottage would be maintained, a place for them to retreat to. Her art would be given a proper studio. She would have control over her own household and her own finances. She was not returning as a possession, but as a partner. He agreed to every condition without hesitation. Their return was quiet. There was no grand announcement. One day, the Duke's carriage simply arrived, and a woman the village knew as Ellen Smith and her son Arthur climbed inside with the Duke. Walking into Blackwood Manor again was surreal. The house was exactly as she had left it, a perfect, preserved museum of her own pain. But it was different now. Alistair was at her side, his hand warm and steady in hers. Arthur ran ahead, his shouts of wonder echoing in the vast, silent halls, filling them with life for the first time in years. They went first to the study. The drawing, her drawing, was now framed and hanging over the mantelpiece. The afternoon light was falling through the window in exactly the same way. The room was no longer a place of accusation and betrayal. It was a place of truth. Alistair came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, and together they watched their son climb into the big leather wingback chair, the one with the frayed arm, looking for all the world like he belonged there. "It is a good likeness," Alistair murmured in her ear. Eleonora leaned back against him, a true, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "I know," she said. "I had a very clear memory of it." The gilded cage was a home at last,